Welcome, dear listeners, to this cozy audiobook adventure, Murder in the Bell Tower, a Miss Marple story. Inspired by the timeless tales of Agatha Christie, we'll journey to the quaint English village of St. Mary Mead in the 1950s, where secrets hide behind lace curtains and afternoon teas. Our sharp-eyed heroine, Miss Jane Marple, will unravel a puzzling mystery with her keen observations and gentle wisdom. So pour yourself a cup of Earl Grey, settle into your favorite armchair, and let the story unfold. This complete tale is divided into 10 chapters for your enjoyment. Narrated with warmth and detail, it should run about an hour and a half in total. And now, without further ado, we begin.
Chapter 1. The Silent Bells. In the tranquil village of St. Mary Mead, nestled in the verdant folds of the English countryside, the summer of 1952 unfolded with the gentle predictability of a well-worn calendar. Thatched cottages, their roofs golden in the morning sun, lined the winding lanes, their gardens bursting with roses and hollyhocks. The High Street, a charming ribbon of cobblestones, bustled quietly with villagers exchanging pleasantries outside the post office or pausing to admire Mrs. Weatherby's prize-winning marigolds. At the heart of the village stood St. Mary's Church, its ancient stone walls weathered by centuries, its bell tower rising like a sentinel over the green. The tower's bells, 5 in number, had rung faithfully every hour since the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, their sonorous peals as much a part of St. Mary Mead as the chatter of sparrows or the scent of freshly baked scones. Miss Jane Marple, a slight figure with snow-white hair and a penchant for pastel cardigans, lived in a modest cottage on the High Street, its windows framed by climbing clematis. Known to all as an elderly spinster of unassuming habits, she spent her days tending her garden, knitting intricate shawls, and observing the world with eyes that missed nothing. Her neighbors thought her merely a kindly old lady, fond of gossip and bird-watching. But those who knew her better, like her nephew Raymond West, the celebrated novelist, recognized the razor-sharp mind behind her gentle smile. Miss Marple had a knack for noticing the small, seemingly insignificant details that others overlooked, and it was this gift that often unraveled the quiet mysteries of village life. On this particular Sunday morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to an unsettling anomaly. The church bells, which should have rung out at 8 o'clock with their customary vigor, remained silent. Villagers paused mid-task, teacups hovering, or newspapers crinkling. Mrs. Price Ridley, the village's self-appointed guardian of propriety, peered from her lace-curtained window, her thin lips pursed. "Most peculiar," she muttered, adjusting her spectacles. "Mr. Humphrey never misses a peal, never." Mr. Elias Humphrey was the village's bell-ringer, a robust man in his early 60s, with a weathered face, a booming laugh, and a pipe perpetually tucked in his jacket pocket. For over 30 years he had climbed the narrow spiral staircase of the bell tower to tend the ropes and pulleys, coaxing music from the ancient bronze bells with a skill that bordered on artistry. His devotion to the task was legendary. Rain or shine, he ensured the bells sang, marking the hours, weddings and festivals with their resonant tones. The villagers relied on him as they did the sunrise, and his absence that morning sent ripples of unease through the community. By 8:30, a small crowd had gathered outside St. Mary's Church. Reverend Leonard Clement, the vicar, a kindly man with a perpetually distracted air, hurried across the churchyard, his black cassock flapping. "Perhaps Elias overslept," he suggested, though his furrowed brow betrayed doubt. He pushed open the heavy oak door to the bell tower, its hinges creaking ominously, and ascended the worn stone steps. The crowd waited below, their murmurs growing hushed as the minutes ticked by. Moments later, a cry echoed from the tower. "Good heavens!" Reverend Clement's voice, usually so measured, carried a note of alarm. The villagers exchanged glances, and young Tom Wilkins, the assistant bell ringer, sprinted up the steps 2 at a time. Miss Jane Marple, who had been pruning her roses nearby and had joined the gathering, stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, her knitting bag slung over one arm. Her sharp blue eyes followed Tom's ascent, noting the tension in his broad shoulders. When Tom reappeared, his face was ashen. He stabbered, It's Mr. Humphrey. He's dead." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Mrs. Price Ridley clutched her handbag, declaring, "Dead? In the bell tower? Preposterous!" But the truth could not be denied. Reverend Clement descended, his hands trembling, as he confirmed the grim discovery. Elias Humphrey lay crumpled at the base of the bell tower, his body sprawled amid the tangle of ropes and pulleys. A length of thick bell rope was loosely draped around his neck, its coarse fibers stark against his pale skin. His pipe lay nearby, unlit, and his eyes stared blankly at the vaulted ceiling. Word spread swiftly, as it always did in St. Mary Mead. By midday, Inspector Slack from the county police had arrived, his brisk manner and neatly pressed uniform a stark contrast to the villagers' disarray. He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, his notebook open. "Looks like an accident," he announced gruffly to the assembled onlookers. "Humphrey must have slipped while adjusting the ropes, tangled himself up and fell." The crowd murmured agreement, but Miss Marple, now seated on a bench outside her cottage, sipping tea and overhearing the chatter, tilted her head thoughtfully. "Accidents in bell towers are rare," she muttered to herself, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. "And Elias Humphrey was as sure-footed as a mountain goat. He knew those ropes like his own hands." As the afternoon wore on, whispers of foul play began to circulate. Humphrey had been in excellent health, with no history of fainting or clumsiness. The bell tower was his sanctuary, a place he navigated with ease, and no one else had reason to climb its steps without invitation. The central mystery took shape. Elias Humphrey had been strangled with one of his own bell ropes, the act staged to resemble a tragic mishap during routine maintenance. But the deliberate knot around his neck, loose as if to suggest an accident, hinted at something more sinister.
Miss Marple set her teacup down and gazed toward the church. She recalled a conversation with Mrs. Bantry, her dear friend, just days ago. Elias was troubled, Dolly had said over scones at the manor. Something about the church funds and a row with that pompous Mr. Hargreaves. Miss Marple's mind turned to the suspects who might have crossed paths with the bell-ringer. There was Reginald Hargreaves, the churchwarden, a retired banker with a haughty air, who managed the church's finances. Rumor had it Humphrey had questioned some discrepancies in the accounts. Then there was young Tom Wilkins, the ambitious assistant ringer, eager to take on more responsibility, but frustrated by Humphrey's traditional ways. Mrs. Lydia Finch, Humphrey's sister-in-law, a quiet seamstress with a simmering resentment over a family dispute, was another possibility. And Colonel Arthur Bantry, Dolly's husband, had clashed with Humphrey over a proposed memorial plaque that would alter the tower's mechanics. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the village green, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to the vicarage. Reverend Clement and his lively young wife Griselda would likely have insights into Humphrey's recent moods. She tucked her knitting into her bag and sat off, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the path. The village hummed with its usual warmth. Children laughed as they played cricket, and the scent of baking drifted from the bakery. But beneath it all, a current of unease lingered. At the vicarage, Griselda greeted her with a tray of tea and biscuits. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it dreadful?" she exclaimed, her modern hat bobbing. "Poor Elias, found like that. Leonard's beside himself." The vicar nodded, his face pale. "I can't fathom it. Elias was so careful. But he'd been tense lately. Mentioned some trouble with the tower's upkeep." Miss Marple smiled faintly, filing away these details. As she left the vicarage, she passed Mrs. Hargreaves in the lane,
the churchwarden's wife, a prim woman with a sharp tongue. Tragic, Mrs. Hargreaves said, selecting apples from a market stall. But Elias was getting old, sloppy with his knots, no doubt. Miss Marple noted a faint smudge of grease on her woman's sleeve, curious for someone so fastidious. "Indeed," she replied softly, her mind already turning over the threads of this puzzling mystery.
Chapter 2. Whispers Over Tea. The sun climbed higher over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the village green, where children scampered and a pair of robins flitted between the yew trees. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over one arm, made her way along the high street toward the vicarage, her steps measured but purposeful. The silence of the church bells still lingered in the air, an absence as palpable as the scent of lavender from Mrs. Weatherby's garden. The mysterious death of Elias Humphrey in the bell tower had set tongues wagging, and Miss Marple knew that the vicarage, with its endless cups of tea and Griselda's penchant for chatter, would be the perfect place to gather the first threads of this puzzling affair. The vicarage, a rambling Georgian house with ivy creeping up its walls, stood just beyond the churchyard. Its front garden was a riot of color, with hollyhocks nodding in the breeze and a row of neat vegetable patches tended by Reverend Leonard Clement in his rare moments of leisure. Griselda Clement, the vicar's young wife, flung open the door before Miss Marple could knock, her bright eyes sparkling with a mix of excitement and distress. Her modern hat, adorned with a single peacock feather, bobbed as she ushered Miss Marple inside. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it simply dreadful?" Griselda exclaimed, leading the way to the sitting room, where a tray of tea and freshly baked scones awaited. "Poor Mr. Humphrey, found like that in the bell tower. Leonard's been in a state all morning. He found him, you know, quite a shock." Reverend Clement, seated by the window with a sermon half-written on the table before him, looked up with a weary smile. His round face, usually cheerful, was shadowed with concern, and his hands fidgeted with a fountain pen. "Indeed, Jane," he said, rising to offer her a chair, "it's a terrible business. Elias was the soul of reliability. I can't imagine how this happened." Miss Marple settled into a chintz-covered armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she drew out a ball of pale blue wool. "A most unfortunate incident," she agreed, her voice gentle, but her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "The inspector believes it was an accident, but I understand Elias was remarkably careful in the tower. Had he seemed troubled to you, Leonard?" The vicar hesitated, glancing at Griselda, who was pouring tea with a clatter of cups. "Well, he was perhaps a bit out of sorts lately. There were disagreements, you see. Elias wanted to ring a full peal for the village fete next month, 6 bells, a grand affair. But Mr. Hargreaves, the churchwarden, thought it was excessive, said it would disturb the village and cost too much to maintain the ropes." Griselda handed Miss Marple a cup, her expression animated. "And then there's young Tom Wilkins, the assistant ringer. Such a strapping lad, but Elias called him careless, said he didn't respect the bells properly, always rushing the pulls, knotting the ropes wrong. They had a proper row last week, didn't they, Leonard?" "Yes," the vicar admitted, rubbing his temple. "Tom's eager to learn, but Elias was particular. He didn't like anyone meddling with his bells." Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting the vicar's trembling hands and Griselda's quick glances toward the churchyard, visible through the window. The couple's agitation was understandable, yet there was something in their manner, a nervous edge, that piqued her curiosity. "Disagreements can be trying," she said mildly. "Did Elias mention anything else, perhaps about the church funds or other village matters?" Griselda's cup rattled in its saucer,
"Oh, well, he did grumble about the accounts once or twice," she said, her voice a shade too bright. "Said Mr. Hargreaves was too tight-fisted with the maintenance budget. But you know Elias, he loved those bells like they were his children." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing these tidbits. The vicarage, with its warm, cluttered charm, was a hub of village gossip, and Griselda's chatter often revealed more than she intended. As they spoke, Miss Marple's eyes drifted to a small photograph on the mantelpiece. Elias Humphrey, pipe in hand, standing proudly by the bell tower. His weathered face held a stubborn glint, a man not easily swayed. Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple decided to stop by the village shop, a tiny establishment run by Miss Weatherby's niece, Clara, who dispensed groceries and gossip with equal enthusiasm. The shop's bell jingled as Miss Marple entered, and she found Mrs. Amelia Hargreaves, the churchwarden's wife, examining a tin of biscuits with her usual fastidiousness. Mrs. Hargreaves was a tall, angular woman in her 50s, her gray hair pinned tightly and her lips set in a perpetual line of disapproval. Her navy dress was immaculate, save for a faint smudge of grease on one sleeve, a detail that caught Miss Marple's eye immediately.
"Good afternoon, Mrs. Hargreaves," Miss Marple said, selecting a packet of tea. "Such a shock about poor Mr. Humphrey." Mrs. Hargreaves sniffed, placing the biscuits in her basket. "Tragic, yes, but hardly surprising. Elias was getting on in years. Sloppy with his knots, if you ask me. Those ropes are heavy, dangerous if you're not careful." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone polite, but her gaze lingering on the grease smudge. It was an odd mark for a woman who prided herself on spotless attire, and it reminded Miss Marple of the oil used to lubricate the bell tower's pulleys. Elias did seem devoted to his work. I suppose he spent most of his time in the tower alone. Mrs. Hargreaves' eyes flickered. "Oh, yes, always up there, fiddling with those bells. A bit obsessive, if you ask me. My Reginald tried to talk sense into him, modernize things, you know, but Elias wouldn't hear of it." Miss Marple smiled faintly, filing away the hint of defensiveness in the woman's voice. As she paid for her tea, Clara leaned over the counter, her round face eager. "Miss Marple, did you hear? They're saying it might not be an accident. Mrs. Finch was in earlier, nearly in tears. She's Elias's sister-in-law, you know, and she said he'd been arguing with half the village lately." "Did she now?" Miss Marple said, her interest piqued. Mrs. Lydia Finch, a quiet seamstress who lived in a small cottage by the river, was known for her reserved nature, but Miss Marple recalled a recent conversation with Dolly Bantry about a family dispute. Lydia's late husband, Elias's brother, had left behind a silver bell, a family heirloom, that Elias had claimed as his own. The matter had left Lydia bitter, or so Dolly had said. As Miss Marple stepped back into the sunshine, she reflected on the emerging picture. Elias Humphrey's death, with the bell rope around his neck, was no simple accident. The method, strangulation staged to look like a mishap, suggested a calculated mind, someone familiar with the tower's workings. The suspects were beginning to take shape. Reverend Clement, whose nervous demeanor hinted at unspoken worries, Mr. Reginald Hargreaves, whose control of the church funds had come under scrutiny, young Tom Wilkins, whose ambition might have clashed with Elias's authority, Mrs. Lydia Finch, nursing a grudge over a family heirloom, and perhaps even Colonel Bantry, whose disagreement over a memorial plaque had been heated. Miss Marple paused by the churchyard gate, her eyes drawn to the bell tower's silhouette against the sky. A group of villagers lingered nearby, their voices low. "It's a shame," said Mr. Polk, the butcher, shaking his head. "Elias was a good man, but he didn't mince words, rubbed some folks the wrong way." "Like who?" asked Mrs. Price Ridley, her ears practically twitching. "Oh, you know," Mr. Polk said vaguely. "The churchwarden, for one. And that young Tom was always skulking about, wanting to take over." Miss Marple listened quietly, her knitting needles still for a moment. The village's warmth enveloped her, the laughter of children, the clink of teacups from a nearby cottage, but beneath it lay a current of suspicion. She thought of the grease on Mrs. Hargreaves' sleeve, the vicar's trembling hands, and Clara's mention of Lydia Finch's tears. Small details, but in St. Mary Mead, small details often held the key to great truths.
As she turned toward home, Miss Marple resolved to attend Dolly Bantry's tea party that afternoon. The manor would be abuzz with village talk, and with Colonel Bantry, Mr. Hargreaves, and perhaps Tom Wilkins in attendance, she might glean more clues. "People are so like their habits," she murmured to herself, "and habits, like bell ropes, can tangle in the most revealing ways."
Chapter 3. The Suspects Emerge. By the time the afternoon sun cast a warm, honeyed light over St. Mary Mead, Miss Jane Marple had pieced together a preliminary list of those who might have had reason to wish Elias Humphrey ill. Her mind, ever active like the bees buzzing in her rose garden, turned over the fragments of conversation from the vicarage and the village shop. The grease smudge on Mrs. Hargreaves' sleeve, the vicar's trembling hands, Clara's mention of Lydia Finch's tears. These were but small threads, yet, in the tapestry of village life, they could weave a revealing pattern. With Dolly Bantry's tea party imminent, Miss Marple smoothed her cardigan, tucked her knitting into her bag, and set off for Gossington Hall, the Bantrys' elegant manor house on the outskirts of the village. Gossington Hall, with its sprawling lawns and Georgian facade, was a hub of social activity in St. Mary Mead. Dolly Bantry, a vivacious woman in her 50s with a penchant for dramatic hats and even more dramatic stories, delighted in hosting gatherings that brought the village together. Today's tea party, originally planned to discuss the upcoming fete, had taken on a somber tone in light of Humphrey's death. As Miss Marple arrived, she was greeted by Dolly herself, who enveloped her in a perfumed hug. "Jane, darling, what a dreadful day!" Dolly exclaimed, her voice a theatrical whisper. "Poor Elias, strangled by his own bell rope. It's like something out of one of Raymond's novels. Come in. Everyone's here, buzzing like bees." The drawing-room was filled with the gentle hum of conversation, the clink of china, and the scent of cucumber sandwiches and Victoria sponge. Villagers mingled amid the chintz sofas and polished side tables, their faces a mix of sympathy and curiosity. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea from a maid and settled into a corner armchair, her eyes scanning the room like a bird-watcher spotting rare species. First among the suspects was Reverend Leonard Clement, who stood by the fireplace, conversing earnestly with Colonel Arthur Bantry. The vicar, his cassock exchanged for a tweed jacket, still bore the pallor of shock from his morning discovery. His hands, Miss Marple noted, clasped his teacup a bit too tightly, and his eyes darted occasionally to the window, as if expecting a spectre from the churchyard. The Reverend's motive, if any, seemed tied to the church's modernization plans. Elias Humphrey had been vocally opposed to installing electric lights in the bell tower, arguing it would spoil the ancient ambiance. "Tradition must be preserved," Humphrey had reportedly thundered at a parish meeting. Had the disagreement escalated? Colonel Bantry, a blustery man with a mustache like a hedge and a voice honed on parade grounds, slapped the vicar on the back. "Chin up, old chap, accidents happen." Though I must say, Humphrey was a stubborn sort. Remember our tiff over the memorial plaque? Wanted to bolt it right where it would foul the bell ropes. Nonsense. Miss Marple smiled faintly, recalling the colonel's proposal. a brass plaque commemorating his war service, to be affixed in the tower. Humphrey had refused, citing structural concerns, but whispers suggested it was more about the colonel's ego clashing with Humphrey's authority. The colonel, for all his bluster, had a temper, and Miss Marple observed the way his knuckles whitened on his walking stick, a habit when annoyed. Nearby, Mr. Reginald Hargreaves, the churchwarden, held court with a group of ladies, his pomposity on full display. A retired banker with a paunch and a gold watch chain, Hargreaves spoke in measured tones, as if dispensing financial advice. A great loss to the parish, but Elias was imprudent with the funds, insisted on expensive rope replacements when patching would suffice.
Mrs. Hargreaves, standing stiffly beside him, nodded agreement, her sharp eyes scanning the room. The grease smudge on her sleeve was gone, freshly laundered perhaps, but Miss Marple's memory was keen. Hargreaves managed the church accounts, and Humphrey had discovered irregularities, small sums siphoned for miscellaneous expenses. Had Humphrey threatened exposure? Miss Marple sipped her tea, watching as Hargreaves' hand brushed his wife's arm, a gesture of solidarity or warning. Young Tom Wilkins, the assistant bell-ringer, hovered near the buffet, piling his plate with sandwiches. A strapping farmhand in his early 20s, with tousled hair and a shy grin, Tom seemed out of place amid the genteel crowd. Yet his eyes, Miss Marple noticed, held a flicker of ambition. As Griselda Clement had mentioned, Tom dreamed of taking over the bell-ringing duties, but Humphrey had deemed him careless. Too hasty with the pulls, Humphrey had complained. Last week they'd argued publicly in the churchyard, Tom storming off with clenched fists. Now as Tom caught Miss Marple's daze, he fidgeted, dropping a cucumber slice. "Terrible about Mr. Humphrey," he muttered when she approached. "He taught me everything, miss. Wouldn't harm a fly." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied gently. "You must have spent much time in the tower with him. Did he seem worried lately?" Tom shifted his weight. "A bit. Said someone was meddling with the ropes. Found 'em tangled odd-like one morning." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. A clue, hidden in everyday observation. Deliberate tampering? She filed it away, noting Tom's calloused hands, strong enough to handle ropes or to wield them maliciously. The last suspect, Mrs. Lydia Finch, sat quietly in a window seat, her sewing basket at her feet. A mousy woman in her late 50s with graying hair and a faded dress, Lydia was Humphrey's sister-in-law, widowed these past 5 years. Her motive stemmed from a family heirloom, a small silver bell, part of the church's history, which Humphrey had inherited and refused to relinquish. "It belongs to the church," he'd insisted, but Lydia claimed it was her husband's by right. Resentment had festered, and now, with Humphrey's death, she stood to inherit his modest savings, and perhaps the bell. Approaching with a plate of cake, Miss Marple engaged her in conversation. "Such a loss, Mrs. Finch. Elias was family to you." Lydia's eyes, red-rimmed, averted. "Yes, though we didn't always see eye to eye. That silver bell, it was my Arthur's pride." Her fingers twisted a handkerchief, and Miss Marple spotted a fresh cut on her thumb, perhaps from sewing or something sharper. As the tea party progressed, the suspects mingled innocently, their conversations laced with condolences. Colonel Bantry boomed. "Poor Elias, stubborn chap, but reliable." Yet Miss Marple observed Tom's fidgety hands when the bell tower was mentioned, Lydia's averted gaze, and the Hargreaves' whispered exchanges. Reverend Clement, too, seemed distracted, excusing himself early with a headache. A red herring emerged when Mrs. Price Ridley, ever the gossip, announced,
"I saw a stranger near the church last night, shifty fellow." But Miss Marple dismissed it. Strangers were rare in St. Mary Mead, and this one proved to be a harmless traveler. Over cucumber sandwiches, Dolly Bantry pulled Miss Marple aside. "Jane, you see everything. Do you think it was murder?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured. "People reveal themselves in small ways, like a misplaced glove or a smudged sleeve." As the party wound down, Miss Marple strolled home through the village green, where children played and the evening light gilded the cottages. The warm community atmosphere enveloped her, the NI ladies planning the fete, the baker waving from his shop. But the mystery loomed like the silent bell tower. Elias Humphrey's death was no accident. The staged rope suggested premeditation. Motives abounded. Financial discrepancies for Hargreaves, ambition for Tom, resentment for Lydia, ego for the colonel, and perhaps hidden worries for the vicar. Reaching her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her garden chair, knitting resuming its rhythmic click. Human nature is much the same everywhere, she reflected, and in a village like ours, secrets can't stay buried long.
Chapter 4. Shadows in the Churchyard. The sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the churchyard where ancient yews stood sentinel, their gnarled branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. The village, bathed in the soft glow of twilight, retained its comforting charm. Children's laughter echoed from the green, and the scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the faint aroma of Mrs. Weatherby's lavender borders. Yet, beneath this cozy veneer, the mysterious death of Elias Humphrey weighed heavily on Miss Jane Marple's mind. The bell tower, silent since that fateful morning, loomed over the church like a question mark, its stone facade hiding secrets that Miss Marple was determined to unravel. After the tea party at Gossington Hall, Miss Marple had returned to her cottage, her thoughts swirling with the impressions of the suspects. Reverend Clement's nervous demeanor, Colonel Bantry's bluster, Mr. Hargrave's pomposity, Mrs. Hargrave's greasy sleeve, Tom Wilkins' ambition, and Mrs. Lydia Finch's quiet resentment. Each had a motive, however slight, and the staged nature of Humphrey's death, strangled with a bell rope to mimic an accident, suggested a calculated mind at work. As Monday dawned, Miss Marple decided to observe the village's pulse more closely, beginning with a visit to the churchyard, where Inspector Slack was conducting his inquiries. The churchyard, with its moss-covered tombstones and wildflowers, was a peaceful place, but today it buzzed with activity. Inspector Slack, his uniform crisp and his manner brisk, stood near the bell tower, barking orders to a young constable who was dusting the door for fingerprints. A small crowd of villagers lingered at a respectful distance, their whispers carrying on the breeze. Miss Marple, her knitting bag over her arm, approached quietly, settling on a bench near the church gate. She drew out her needles, the soft click of wool providing a perfect cover for her observations. Inspector Slack was questioning Tom Wilkins, whose broad shoulders hunched defensively. "I told you, sir," Tom said, his voice tight. "I was out walking in the woods that morning. Didn't go near the tower till the vicar called me up." Slack's eyes narrowed. "A walk, eh? Convenient no one saw you. Humphrey was your mentor, but you two argued plenty. Wanted his job, didn't you?" Tom's face reddened. "That's not fair. I respected Mr. Humphrey, even if he was strict. I'd never hurt him." Miss Marple noted the sincerity in Tom's tone, but also his fidgety hands, twisting the hem of his jacket. His alibi was shaky, reliant on his word alone, and the inspector's focus on him seemed to deepen. Yet Miss Marple's instincts told her Tom's ambition, while real, lacked the cunning required for such a staged crime. She turned her attention to the tower door, where the constable was packing up his kit. The heavy oak door, slightly ajar, bore no obvious signs of tampering. But something caught her eye.
a faint scuff mark on the stone step, and nearby a few blades of grass trampled into the earth. Footprints, perhaps. They were small, more suited to a woman's shoe than a man's boot. As Slack moved on to question Mrs. Price Ridley, who had been hovering nearby with her usual air of indignation, Miss Marple rose and wandered closer to the tower. The grass around the base was uneven, and she spotted a cluster of tiny footprints, partially obscured by the morning's dew. They led from the path to the door and back again, suggesting someone had approached stealthily. "Curious," she murmured, recalling the grease smudge on Mrs. Hargrave's sleeve. The churchwarden's wife is meticulous, yet that smudge suggested contact with the bell tower's oily mechanisms. Had she been here, perhaps before Humphrey's death? A red herring surfaced as Mrs. Price Ridley's voice cut through the air. "I saw a figure near the tower at dawn yesterday, a man wearing a hat like Colonel Bantry's. Very suspicious, if you ask me." The colonel, who had just arrived to inspect the church grounds, overheard and bristled. "Nonsense, madam," he boomed, with his mustache quivering. "I was at home with Dolly, having breakfast. Ask her yourself."
Dolly Bantry, trailing behind with a basket of flowers for the altar, nodded vigorously. "Absolutely, Inspector. Arthur was snoring over his kippers at 7 sharp. Not a soul in St. Mary Mead could mistake that sound." The crowd tittered, and Slack scribbled a note, looking unconvinced. Miss Marple, however, suspected Mrs. Price Ridley's shadowy figure was another of her exaggerations, perhaps mistaking a villager for a stranger in the dim light. Still, the colonel's quick defense and Dolly's emphatic support were worth noting. People, Miss Marple knew, often protested loudest when hiding something trivial or significant. As the inspector moved on, Miss Marple lingered by the tower, her eyes scanning the ground. Near the base of the steps, half hidden by a tuft of grass, lay a small object, a twisted pipe cleaner bent into an odd shape, as if used for more than cleaning a pipe. She stooped to pick it up, careful not to draw attention, and tucked it into her bag. Elias Humphrey was a pipe smoker, but his pipe, found in his pocket, had been clean. This pipe cleaner, with its deliberate twist, suggested another purpose, perhaps a makeshift tool. The thought intrigued her, though its significance remained elusive. Returning to her bench, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind turning over the morning's observations. The footprints, the pipe cleaner, the grease smudge. These were small clues, but in St. Mary Mead, small clues often led to great revelations. She recalled a conversation with her gardener, Mr. Polk, who had mentioned seeing Mrs. Hargreaves near the church late Saturday evening, fussing about something. Had she been inspecting the tower or something more? The village's warm rhythm continued around her. Across the green, the Women's Institute ladies were setting up tables for a charity sale, their laughter mingling with the clatter of teacups. Children played tag near the duck pond, and Mr. Weatherby, the baker, waved cheerfully as he delivered loaves. Yet the bell tower's silence cast a subtle pall, a reminder of the mystery at the village's heart. As noon approached, Miss Marple decided to visit the village hall, where Inspector Slack had set up a temporary office. The hall, a modest building with creaky floorboards and a perpetually leaking roof, was abuzz with villagers offering tips and speculation. Inside, Slack was interviewing Mrs. Lydia Finch, whose pale face and trembling hands betrayed her distress. "I only went to the tower last week," Lydia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Elias asked me to mend his jacket. He'd torn it on a nail up there. I left my glove by mistake. Nothing more." Slack pounced on this. "Your glove found in the tower? And you had a grudge against Humphrey, didn't you? That silver bell business?" Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "It was my Arthur's, but I'd never. Elias was family. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in a corner, observed Lydia's genuine grief, but also her nervous fidgeting. The glove was a compelling clue, yet it felt too convenient, almost planted. Lydia's motive, resentment over the heirloom, was real, but her timid nature suggested she lacked the boldness for murder. Still, Miss Marple noted the cut on Lydia's thumb, seen at the tea party. Could it be from a struggle, or merely her sewing needle? As the inspector dismissed Lydia, Miss Marple approached him, her manner deferential. "Inspector, might I ask if you've examined the ropes closely? Elias was so particular about them." Slack frowned, clearly impatient. "Ropes look normal, Miss Marple. One's frayed, likely from Humphrey's fall. Why?" "Oh, nothing," she said airily. "Just an old lady's curiosity." But her curiosity was far from idle. The frayed rope, the footprints, the pipe cleaner. These were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was beginning to see their shape. She left the hall, her mind turning over the suspects. Tom's shaky alibi and ambition made him a target, but his sincerity rang true. The Colonel's hat story was likely a distraction, but his temper warranted scrutiny. Lydia's glove and grudge were suspicious, yet her demeanor suggested innocence. The Hargreaves, with their financial secrets and that telltale grease, loomed large, as did the vicar's unspoken worries. As she strolled back to her cottage, the village green alive with chatter and the scent of baking bread, Miss Marple felt the mystery deepening. "It's like knitting," she mused. "One wrong stitch, and the pattern unravels. But find the right thread, and it all comes clear."
Chapter 5. False Trails and Afternoon Strolls. The morning mist had burned away, leaving St. Mary Mead bathed in the gentle warmth of a summer afternoon. The village green sparkled under the sunlight, with children chasing a ball near the duck pond, and the Women's Institute ladies bustling about their charity stall, their laughter mingling with the clink of coins. The bell tower of St. Mary's Church, still silent since Elias Humphrey's death, cast a long shadow across the churchyard, a constant reminder of the mystery that had unsettled the village's cozy rhythm. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, strolled along the high street, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the cobblestones. Her mind, as sharp as her needles, turned over the clues gathered thus far: the grease smudge on Mrs. Hargreaves' sleeve, the twisted pipe cleaner near the tower steps, the small footprints, and Lydia Finch's misplaced glove. Each was a thread in the tapestry of Elias Humphrey's murder, and Miss Marple was determined to weave them together. Her morning at the churchyard had deepened her suspicions. The staged nature of Humphrey's death, strangled with a bell rope to mimic an accident, pointed to a calculated mind, someone familiar with the tower's workings. The suspects were clear: Reverend Clement, with his nervous demeanor and disagreements over church modernization; Mr. Reginald Hargreaves, whose financial irregularities Humphrey had uncovered; Mrs. Amelia Hargreaves, whose greasy sleeve suggested a visit to the tower; young Tom Wilkins, ambitious but possibly too earnest for murder; Mrs. Lydia Finch, nursing a grudge over a family heirloom; and Colonel Bantry, whose temper had clashed with Humphrey's stubbornness. Yet the red herrings, Mrs. Price Ridley's shadowy figure, and Lydia's glove muddied the waters, and Miss Marple knew the truth lay in the small, everyday observations that others overlooked. As she approached the village shop, Miss Marple decided a chat with Clara, the shop girl, might yield fresh insights. Clara, with her round face and eager gossip, was a font of village news, and her counter was a crossroads for St. Mary Mead's chatter. The shop's bell jingled as Miss Marple entered, finding Clara arranging jars of marmalade, while Mrs. Price Ridley, ever present, inspected a tin of biscuits. "Good afternoon, Clara. I see the village is quite abuzz about poor Mr. Humphrey." Clara's eyes widened. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's awful. They're saying it's murder now, not an accident. I heard Inspector Slack was at the hall all morning, questioning everyone. Mrs. Finch was in earlier, nearly crying again. Said she left her glove in the tower when she mended Elias's jacket last week." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed loudly. "That glove is suspicious, if you ask me. And Mrs. Lydia Finch always had a chip on her shoulder about that silver bell. Mark my words, she's hiding something." Miss Marple smiled politely, noting the glove's prominence in village talk. It was a compelling clue, yet too obvious, almost as if placed to mislead. "Perhaps," she said mildly, "though accidents can leave such traces, can't they? Did you see anyone else near the tower recently, Clara?" Clara leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Well, I shouldn't say, but I saw Mrs. Hargreaves walking by the church Saturday evening, looking cross. And Tom Wilkins was there earlier, carrying a bucket of oil for the bells. Said Mr. Humphrey asked him to fetch it." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Oil for the bells matched the grease on Mrs. Hargreaves' sleeve, and Tom's presence added another layer. "How thoughtful of Tom," she said, her tone neutral. "And Mrs. Hargreaves? Did she seem to be going into the tower?" Clara shrugged. "Couldn't say. She was just pacing near the gate, muttering about expenses."
Leaving the shop, Miss Marple decided on an afternoon stroll through the churchyard, hoping to revisit the scene in daylight. The village hummed with its usual warmth. The baker's boy cycled past with a basket of loaves, and the WI ladies called out cheerful greetings. Yet the silent bells cast a subtle pall, and Miss Marple's thoughts were far from idle. At the churchyard, she paused by the tower steps, where the small footprints she'd noticed yesterday were still visible, though fainter now. The twisted pipe cleaner, safely tucked in her bag, nagged at her. It was an odd find, not typical for cleaning a pipe, and Humphrey's own pipe had been spotless. Was it a tool, perhaps, for tampering with the tower's mechanisms? As she stood there, Griselda Clement appeared, her peacock feather hat bobbing as she hurried across the churchyard with a basket of flowers. "Miss Marple," she called, her voice bright but strained. "Are you sleuthing? Leonard's been so jumpy since yesterday. He was up late writing sermons, or so he says, kept muttering about the tower." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Sermons at midnight? How dedicated! Did he mention what troubled him?" Griselda hesitated, arranging her flowers. "Oh, just the usual. Church funds, the fate. But he did say Elias knew something about old secrets. I thought he meant the bell's history, but now I'm not so sure." The phrase old secrets lingered in Miss Marple's mind. Was the vicar hiding a personal worry, or had Humphrey uncovered something more? She thanked Griselda and continued her stroll, passing the vicarage garden where Reverend Clement was weeding, his movements distracted. His nervous energy suggested more than grief, and Miss Marple filed it away. Her path took her to the riverbank, where Mrs. Lydia Finch's cottage stood, with its windows adorned with lace curtains. Lydia was in her garden, pinning laundry to a line, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly. Miss Marple approached, offering a sympathetic smile. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Finch. I hope you're bearing up." Lydia's eyes darted to the ground. "It's hard, Miss Marple. Elias and I weren't close, but he was family. That glove they found, I only left it because I was in a rush. I'd never harm him." "Of course," Miss Marple said gently, noting the fresh bandage on Lydia's thumb. "That silver bell must have been a sore point, though." Lydia's lips tightened. "It was Arthur's by rights. Elias kept it in the tower, said it belonged there, but I couldn't." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple patted her arm, unconvinced of her guilt but intrigued by her agitation. Returning to the village, Miss Marple encountered Connell Bantry near the post office, his face flushed from a morning ride.
"Terrible business, this Humphrey affair," he said gruffly. "Slack's been sniffing around asking about my hat. Ridiculous! It's muddy from a fox hunt, not some midnight skulking." Miss Marple nodded, recalling Mrs. Price Ridley's tale of a shadowy figure. The colonel's indignation seemed genuine, but his quick defense warranted scrutiny. "I'm sure it's a misunderstanding, though Elias's death does raise questions." The colonel snorted. "Accident, if you ask me. Man was too stubborn to check his ropes properly." Yet Miss Marple doubted this. The frayed rope, mentioned by Slack, was a key clue. If deliberately cut, it pointed to premeditation. As she walked home, she passed the church again, where Tom Wilkins was oiling the gate hinges. He nodded shyly. "Trying to keep busy, miss. Mr. Humphrey would have wanted the place tidy." "You're a good lad, Tom," she replied, noting his strong hands, capable of handling ropes, or worse. Yet his open face suggested loyalty, not deceit. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her garden chair, knitting while she reflected. The village's warmth enveloped her, the distant laughter of children, the scent of baking from next door, but the mystery grew more complex. Lydia's glove was a false trail, too neatly placed. The colonel's hat was another distraction, likely muddied as he claimed, but the pipe cleaner, the footprints, and the grease smudge pointed to the tower, and possibly to Mrs. Hargrave's. Griselda's mention of old secrets hinted at deeper motives, perhaps tied to the vicar or the church funds. "People are like gardens," Miss Marple mused, her needles clicking. "The weeds hide among the flowers, but pull the right one, and the pattern emerges." Chapter 6. Deepening Doubts. The late afternoon sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden sheen across the village green, where the last of the charity stall's visitors lingered, exchanging coins for jars of homemade jam. The air carried the comforting scents of freshly mown grass and baking bread, a reminder of the village's cozy heartbeat. Yet the silent bell tower of St. Mary's Church loomed over the scene, its stone walls guarding the secret of Elias Humphrey's murder. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, sat in her cottage garden, her needles clicking rhythmically as her mind sifted through the growing tangle of clues. The staged strangulation, the grease smudge on Mrs. Hargreaves' sleeve, the twisted pipe cleaner, the small footprints, and Griselda's cryptic mention of old secrets all pointed to a calculated crime, but false trails and misdirection clouded the truth. With each passing hour, the mystery deepened, and Miss Marple knew she must tread carefully to unravel it. The morning's encounters had left her with much to ponder. Lydia Finch's glove, so conveniently found in the bell tower, seemed a deliberate distraction, as did Mrs. Price Ridley's tale of a shadowy figure in a hat like Colonel Bantry's. The footprints and pipe cleaner, however, were more intriguing, suggesting someone had tampered with the tower's mechanisms. The grease smudge on Mrs. Hargreaves' sleeve tied her to the scene, and the vicar's nervous talk of old secrets hinted at hidden motives. Miss Marple resolved to visit the bell tower herself, hoping to see what Inspector Slack, in his brisk efficiency, might have overlooked. With the inspector's grudging permission, Miss Marple made her way to St. Mary's Church as the afternoon waned. The churchyard was quieter now, the earlier bustle replaced by the soft chirping of sparrows. The bell door stood slightly ajar, its oak surface worn smooth by centuries of hands. She ascended the narrow spiral staircase carefully, her sensible shoes steady on the uneven stone steps. The air grew cooler as she climbed, tinged with the musty scent of old wood and stone. At the top, the bell chamber opened before her, a cavernous space where 5 ancient bronze bells hung in their wooden frames, their ropes coiled neatly below. The pulleys gleamed faintly with oil, and the floor was dusted with fine grit, undisturbed since the police's inspection. Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the room. The rope that had been around Humphrey's neck hung among the others,
its frayed end catching her attention. She leaned closer, noting that the fraying was uneven, not the natural wear of constant use, but sharp, deliberate cuts, as if made with a blade. "Most curious," she murmured, her mind racing. The staging of the crime, strangulation disguised as an accident, required knowledge of the ropes and their handling. Who among the suspects had such familiarity? Tom Wilkins, as assistant ringer, certainly did, but so might anyone who frequented the tower, like the churchwarden or his wife. A faint scent caught her notice. Lavender, delicate but unmistakable, lingering in the dusty air. It was an odd fragrance for a bell tower, where oil and wood dominated. Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Hargreaves' perfume, a lavender eau de toilette she wore religiously. Had she been here, perhaps tampering with the ropes? The grease smudge on her sleeve, the footprints, and now this scent formed a compelling thread. But Miss Marple cautioned herself against haste. Clues are like stitches, she thought. One mustn't pull too tightly, lest the fabric tears. Descending the stairs, she paused at the base where Humphrey's body had been found. The police had cleared the area, but a faint chalk outline remained, marking the tragedy. She stooped to examine the floor, her eyes catching a glint of metal in a corner, a tiny screw, likely from the pulley system, but oddly out of place. She tucked it into her bag beside the pipe cleaner, wondering if it too was a piece of the puzzle. Back in the village, Miss Marple joined Dolly Bantry for sherry at Gossington Hall, hoping to glean more from her friend's inexhaustible gossip. The drawing room was warm and inviting, its windows open to the evening breeze. Dolly, resplendent in a floral dress, poured 2 glasses with a flourish. "Jane, you're positively sleuthing, aren't you? I can tell by that look. What's on your mind?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Just tying up loose ends, Dolly. Tell me, have you noticed anything odd about the vicar lately? Griselda mentioned he's been preoccupied." Dolly leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, Leonard's been a bundle of nerves. Griselda says he's been up late, scribbling away. Not just sermons, mind you. Something about old secrets Elias knew. I thought it was about the church's history, but now I wonder. And Amelia Hargreaves, she's been snappier than usual. Snubbed me at the wee meeting yesterday."
Miss Marple's interest sharpened. The lavender scent, the grease smudge, and now Dolly's confirmation of Mrs. Hargreaves' agitation strengthened her suspicions. "And the Colonel?" she asked. "He seemed quite cross about that hat business." Dolly laughed. "Arthur's always cross about something. That hat was muddy from a fox hunt, as he said. He's got an alibi. Our cook saw him at breakfast. But he did grumble about Elias blocking his plaque. Silly man, so proud of his war stories." Miss Marple nodded, mentally crossing the Colonel off her list for now. His temper was real, but his alibi held, and the hat story was likely another red herring. She sipped her sherry, her mind returning to the tower's clues. The frayed rope suggested premeditation, and the lavender scent pointed to Mrs. Hargreaves, but the vicar's old secrets and Tom's familiarity with the ropes kept them in play. Lydia Finch's glove, while suspicious, felt too obvious, and her timid nature didn't align with the crime's boldness. As she left Gossington Hall, Miss Marple encountered Tom Wilkins near the church gate, carrying a ladder for some minor repairs. "Evenin', miss," he said, touching his cap. "Trying to keep things in order like Mr. Humphrey would have wanted." "You're a credit to him, Tom," Miss Marple replied, noting his strong hands and earnest expression. "Did Elias ever mention anyone tampering with the tower's equipment? You said the ropes were tangled oddly." Tom frowned. "He did, miss. Said he found a pulley loose last week, like someone been fiddlin'.
Blamed me at first, but I swore it wasn't me. Then he muttered about Mrs. Hargreaves. She'd been up there asking about the bell's upkeep costs. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Another link to Mrs. Hargreaves, and a loose pulley could explain the tiny screw she'd found. "Thank you, Tom," she said, filing away this detail. Tom's openness suggested innocence, but his access to the tower kept him on her list. The village's warmth enveloped her as she walked home. Children played cricket, and the baker's boy whistled past on his bicycle. Yet the mystery grew more intricate. False leads multiplied. Lydia's glove, the colonel's hat, even Mrs. Price Ridley's shadowy figure. But the real clues, the frayed rope, the lavender scent, the pipe cleaner, and the screw, pointed to someone with motive and opportunity. Mrs. Hargreaves, with her financial secrets and tower visits, was a strong candidate, but the vicar's agitation and Tom's proximity couldn't be ignored. Lydia's grudge, while compelling, seemed insufficient for murder. At her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, knitting a pale blue shawl as she reflected. The village's cozy rhythm, the laughter, the tea parties, the WY chatter, masked a darker undercurrent. "It's like a garden," she mused, her needles clicking. "The weeds hide among the flowers, but dig deep enough, and you find the roots."
Chapter 7. A Glimmer of Truth. The golden light of late afternoon had softened into the gentle dusk of St. Mary Mead, where the village green lay quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a sparrow or the distant laughter of children finishing their games. The air was thick with the scent of blooming roses and the faint tang of wood smoke from a nearby cottage. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she worked on a pale blue shawl, her mind as busy as her hands. The murder of Elias Humphrey, strangled with a bell rope in the church tower and staged to look like an accident, had woven a complex web of clues and misdirection. The grease smudge on Mrs. Hargreaves' sleeve, the twisted pipe cleaner, the small footprints, the frayed rope, the tiny screw, and the lingering scent of lavender in the tower all pointed to a deliberate act. Yet false trails, Lydia Finch's glove, Colonel Bantry's muddy hat, and Mrs. Price Ridley's shadowy figure kept the truth just out of reach. As Tuesday evening settled over the village, Miss Marple felt the first glimmers of clarity emerging, like stars piercing a clouded sky. Her visit to the bell tower had been revealing. The deliberately frayed rope and the lavender scent strongly implicated Mrs. Amelia Hargreaves, whose fastidious nature made the grease smudge on her sleeve all the more telling. The tiny screw and twisted pipe cleaner suggested tampering with the tower's mechanisms, and Griselda Clement's mention of old secrets hinted at deeper motives, possibly tied to the vicar or the church funds. Tom Wilkins, with his access to the tower, remained a suspect, though his earnestness suggested innocence. Lydia Finch's grudge over the silver bell and Colonel Bantry's temper were plausible motives, but the vicar's nervous demeanor and Mr. Hargreaves' financial irregularities kept them in play. Miss Marple knew the key lay in the small details, and she resolved to press further, starting with a closer look at Humphrey's personal effects. With Inspector Slack's permission, she visited the village hall, where the police had stored items found on Humphrey's body. The hall was quiet, its creaky floorboards echoing as Miss Marple entered, her knitting bag a familiar prop. Slack, looking harried, handed her a small box containing Humphrey's possessions, a watch, a handkerchief, and his pipe, still unlit and oddly clean. "Not much to go on," Slack grunted. "The man smoked like a chimney, yet this pipe's spotless. Strange, that." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Indeed, Inspector. Elias never rang the bells without his pipe. It was his ritual." She examined the pipe closely, noting its pristine bowl. If Humphrey hadn't smoked that morning, it suggested he'd been interrupted or lured to the tower under false pretenses. The twisted pipe cleaner she'd found, bent into an unusual shape, came to mind. Was it a tool, perhaps used to pick a lock or adjust a pulley?
She kept this thought to herself, thanking Slack and tucking the observation away. Leaving the hall, Miss Marple decided to revisit Tom Wilkins, who was likely at the church tending to minor repairs in Humphrey's absence. She found him in the churchyard, polishing the brass fittings on the tower door. His broad face lit up with a shy smile. "Evening, Miss Marple. Just keeping things shipshape like Mr. Humphrey taught me." "You're a credit to him, Tom," she said warmly. "Tell me, did you ever see Mrs. Hargreaves in the tower? You mentioned she'd been asking about upkeep costs." His brow furrowed. "Aye, miss. Last Thursday I saw her arguing with Mr. Humphrey up there. She was cross, saying the bells were a drain on the church funds. He told her to mind her own business, sharp-like. She left in a huff, muttering about sorting things out." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions about Mrs. Hargreaves deepening. The argument, combined with the grease smudge and lavender scent, painted a damning picture. "And the pulleys?" she asked. "You said one was loose. Did you notice anything else out of place?" Tom hesitated, then nodded. "Found a screw on the floor a week back, near the main pulley. Thought it was odd, but Mr. Humphrey said he'd fix it. Never got the chance, I reckon." The tiny screw in Miss Marple's bag seemed to pulse with significance. It matched Tom's description, suggesting someone had tampered with the pulley before Humphrey's death, perhaps to weaken the mechanism and stage the accident. Mrs. Hargreaves, with her access to the tower and motive tied to the church funds, was a strong candidate, but Miss Marple needed more. Her next stop was the vicarage, where she hoped to probe Reverend Clement's cryptic old secrets. Griselda greeted her with a tray of tea and scones, her peacock feather hat replaced by a simpler headscarf. "Jane, you're tireless," she exclaimed. "Leonard's in the study, fretting over his sermons. This business with Elias has him rattled." The vicar emerged, his face pale and his hands still trembling slightly. "Ms. Marple, any news? The village is in a state."
"Only questions, I'm afraid," she replied gently. "Griselda mentioned Elias knew of old secrets. Can you shed light on that, Leonard?" The vicar's eyes flickered, and he sat heavily. "It's nothing concrete. Elias once said he'd found papers in the tower, old parish records tucked behind a beam. He thought they might embarrass someone, but he wouldn't say who. I told him to leave it be, but he was stubborn." Miss Marple's mind raced. Parish records could reveal financial misdeeds or personal scandals, perhaps tied to the Hargreaves or even the vicar himself. "Did he show you these papers?" "No," Clement admitted. "He said he'd deal with it himself. That was a week ago." This new clue, a hidden cache of records, added weight to the motive of someone desperate to keep secrets buried. Miss Marple thanked the Clements and returned home, pausing by the churchyard to examine the tower steps again. The small footprints were nearly gone, erased by foot traffic, but the memory of them, combined with the lavender scent and grease smudge, kept Mrs. Hargreaves at the forefront of her thoughts. At her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, knitting as she reflected. The village's warmth enveloped her, the distant clatter of teacups, the laughter of children, but the mystery was crystallizing. A crucial discovery had emerged. A clean pipe suggested Humphrey was lured to the tower, and the frayed rope and loose screw pointed to deliberate sabotage. Tom's account of Mrs. Hargreaves' argument, coupled with the lavender scent, narrowed the suspects. Yet the vicar's mention of parish records opened new possibilities. Could Mr. Hargreaves, as churchwarden, have been protecting his own secrets? Or was the vicar himself hiding something? To test her theory, Miss Marple invited Dolly Bantry for tea the next morning, knowing her friend's gossip would fill in gaps. Over scones in the garden,
Dolly leaned forward, her eyes bright. "Jane, I heard something juicy. Mrs. Hargreaves was seen buying oil at the hardware shop last week. Said it was for her bicycle, but she doesn't ride. And Reginald's been jumpy, snapping at everyone." Miss Marple's needles paused. Oil for the bells, not a bicycle, matched the grease smudge perfectly. "And Colonel Bantry?" she asked, ensuring no suspect was overlooked. "Oh, Arthur's in the clear," Dolly said. "I found a telegram receipt in his study. Sent at dawn on Sunday. He was at the post office, not the tower. But Amelia Hargreaves, she's been avoiding me since the Fate Committee meeting." This eliminated Colonel Bantry, his alibi solidified by the telegram. Miss Marple's list narrowed. Mrs. Hargreaves, with her motive, opportunity, and physical clues. Mr. Hargreaves, possibly complicit. The vicar, with his vague secrets. Tom, whose access was undeniable. And Lydia, whose grudge seemed weaker by comparison. As dusk deepened, the village's cozy rhythm, cricket games, WI chatter, the scent of baking, continued, but Miss Marple felt the truth drawing closer. "It's like a shawl," she mused, holding up her knitting. "Each stitch builds on the last, and soon the pattern is clear."
Chapter 8. Pieces Falling into Place. The twilight of St. Mary Mead wrapped the village in a soft violet haze, the cottages glowing warmly as lamplight spilled through lace-curtained windows. The scent of honeysuckle drifted from garden hedges, mingling with the faint aroma of wood smoke, a testament to the village's cozy charm. Yet the silent bell tower of St. Mary's Church stood as a somber reminder of Elias Humphrey's murder, its mystery tightening like a knot in Miss Jane Marple's mind. Her knitting needles clicked steadily in her cottage garden, where she sat beneath a climbing rose, piecing together the clues that had emerged over the past days. The frayed bell rope, the lavender scent, the grease smudge on Mrs. Hargreaves's sleeve, the twisted pipe cleaner, the tiny screw, and the hint of old secrets in parish records. False trails, Lydia Finch's glove, and Colonel Bantry's muddy hat had been swept aside, and now, as Wednesday evening settled over the village, Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery drawing together, the pattern almost visible. Her visit to the bell tower and the examination of Humphrey's clean pipe had solidified her suspicion that he was lured to his death, the strangulation staged to mimic an accident. The frayed rope and loose screw pointed to sabotage, and the lavender scent and grease smudge strongly implicated Mrs. Amelia Hargreaves, whose motive seemed tied to Humphrey's discovery of financial irregularities in the church funds. Tom Wilkins's account of her argument with Humphrey, combined with Dolly Bantry's report of her buying oil, tightened the net. Yet Reverend Clement's nervous mention of old secrets and Mr. Hargreaves' role as churchwarden kept them in play, while Tom's access to the tower and Lydia's grudge lingered as possibilities. Miss Marple knew the truth lay in testing these threads, and she resolved to probe deeper, starting with a gentle confrontation. Her opportunity came at the Women's Institute meeting that evening, held in the village hall. The hall was abuzz with chatter, the tables laden with tea cakes and jam tarts, the air filled with the clink of teacups and the hum of village gossip. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, took a seat near the back, her eyes scanning the room. Mrs. Hargreaves was there, her navy dress pristine, her manner as sharp as ever. Mr. Hargreaves stood nearby, pontificating to a group about the Fates budget, while Reverend Clement hovered by the tea-urn, his face pale. Lydia Finch sat quietly, her sewing basket at her feet, and Tom Wilkins, invited as a helper, carried trays of biscuits with his usual earnestness. As the meeting began, Mrs. Price Ridley launched into a tirade about the Fates flower arrangements, but Miss Marple's attention was on the suspects. She approached Mr. Hargreaves during a lull, her tone mild. "Mr. Hargreaves, I understand Elias Humphrey had concerns about the church accounts. Did he ever discuss them with you?" Hargreaves's face stiffened, his gold watch chain glinting as he adjusted his tie. "He did, Miss Marple, but it was a misunderstanding. Elias thought I'd mismanaged funds, but I explained it was a simple error, overstated expenses. I made a donation to smooth things over." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "How generous! And did Elias accept your explanation?" Hargreaves hesitated, his gaze flickering to his wife, who was arranging teacups nearby. "He agreed to let it drop, said he'd keep it quiet." The admission was revealing. Humphrey's threat to expose the irregularities gave Hargreaves a motive, but his soft, uncalloused hands, unlike those needed to handle heavy bell ropes, suggested he wasn't the strangler. Miss Marple thanked him and moved toward Mrs. Hargreaves, who was now fussing over a tray of scones. "Mrs. Hargreaves," Miss Marple said gently, "you must be so busy with the fete. I heard you were in the bell tower recently, discussing upkeep costs with Elias. It must be difficult managing such expenses."
Mrs. Hargreaves' lips tightened, and a faint flush crept up her neck. "I did speak to him, yes. The bells are a drain on the parish, and Elias was stubborn about repairs. But I left him to it. He was fine when I saw him." Miss Marple noted the defensive edge in her voice and the absence of the grease smudge, likely scrubbed away. "Of course," she said. "Though I imagine the tower's oil and dust can be troublesome. I once got machine oil on my best cardigan, quite a chore to remove." Mrs. Hargreaves' eyes darted away, and she busied herself with the scones. The reaction confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. The grease smudge, the lavender scent, and Tom's account of her argument pointed to her presence in the tower, possibly with intent. As the meeting wound down, Miss Marple lingered, observing Reverend Clement. He was quieter than usual, his hands fidgeting with a hymn book. She approached him, her voice soft. "Leonard, you mentioned old parish records Elias found. Have you looked for them in the tower?" The vicar started, his eyes wide. "No, I haven't. Elias said they were hidden behind a beam, but I thought it best to leave them be. They might stir up trouble, old debts, perhaps." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The records could hold the key to the motive, perhaps detailing financial misdeeds tied to the Hargreaves. She resolved to search the tower later with Slack's permission. For now, she turned to Lydia Finch, who was packing her sewing. "Mrs. Finch, I hope you're managing. Elias's death must be hard, with the silver bell matter unresolved." Lydia's face crumpled. "It was Arthur's, Miss Marple, but Elias wouldn't budge. Still, I'd never hurt him. My inheritance is barely enough for a new sewing machine." The modesty of Lydia's motive weakened her as a suspect, and her genuine grief seemed authentic. Miss Marple patted her arm, her list narrowing further. Colonel Bantry's alibi had held, and Lydia's involvement seemed unlikely. Tom, too, was fading as a suspect. His openness and a milkman's confirmation of seeing him near the woods on Sunday morning bolstered his alibi. Returning home, Miss Marple reflected on a crucial discovery: the pipe cleaner, twisted into a shape resembling a lockpick. She examined it under her lamp, confirming its deliberate bend. Had it been used to unlock the tower door or tamper with the pulley? The screw, too, suggested sabotage, aligning with Tom's report of a loose pulley. These clues, combined with the lavender scent and grease, pointed squarely at Mrs. Hargreaves.
But Mr. Hargreaves' admission about the funds suggested he might know more than he let on. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the church again, accompanied by a reluctant Inspector Slack. In the bell chamber, she searched behind the beams, finding a dusty packet of papers tied with twine. They were old parish accounts, detailing small but consistent withdrawals labeled miscellaneous. The handwriting matched Mr. Hargreaves' ledgers, but a note in Humphrey's scrawl read, "Amelia's doing, confronted her." This was the linchpin. Mrs. Hargreaves, not her husband, had been embezzling, and Humphrey's threat to expose her had sealed his fate. As she left the tower, she passed Tom, who was oiling the gate. "You've been a great help, Tom," she said. "Did you ever smell lavender in the tower?" Tom nodded. "Once, last week. Thought it was odd. Mr. Humphrey didn't use fancy scents." The village's warmth, children playing, teacups clinking, and the WI's chatter enveloped her as she walked home, but the puzzle was nearly complete. Mrs. Hargreaves' motive, opportunity, and physical evidence were overwhelming, but Miss Marple needed a final confrontation to confirm it. "It's like knitting," she mused, her needles clicking.
Chapter 9. The Revelation in the Parlor. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a gentle chill, the village settling into a quiet hush as lamplight glowed from cottage windows and the scent of wood smoke curled through the lanes. The green lay still, the children's games long ended, and the distant clatter of teacups from the Women's Institute meeting had faded into the night. Yet within Miss Jane Marple's modest cottage, a different kind of gathering was about to unfold, one that would unravel the mystery of Elias Humphrey's murder in the bell tower. Her garden roses, barely visible in the twilight, nodded as if in anticipation, while her knitting needles lay idle on the table, the pale blue shawl nearly complete. The clues had woven together: the frayed bell rope, the lavender scent, the grease smudge on Mrs. Hargreaves' sleeve, the twisted pipe cleaner, the tiny screw, and the parish records revealing Mrs. Hargreaves' embezzlement. False trails, Lydia Finch's glove, and Colonel Bantry's muddy hat had been swept aside, and now, on this Thursday evening, Miss Jane Marple was ready to lay bare the truth. She had invited the key figures to her cottage under the guise of a friendly tea, a common enough event in St. Mary Mead to raise no suspicion. The parlor, with its chintz curtains and polished mahogany table, was set with a delicate tea service, scones, and a Victoria sponge, the comforting aroma filling the room. Inspector Slack, skeptical but intrigued by Miss Marple's quiet insistence, arrived first, his uniform crisp and his notebook at the ready. Reverend Leonard Clement and Griselda followed, the vicar's face pale, and Griselda's eyes bright with curiosity. Mr. and Mrs. Hargreaves entered together, Reginald puffing out his chest and Amelia's lips set in a tight line. Tom Wilkins, awkward in his Sunday best, arrived next, and Mrs. Lydia Finch, clutching her sewing basket, slipped in last, her eyes red-rimmed. Dolly Bantry, ever Miss Marple's ally, completed the group, her floral dress a splash of cheer in the tense atmosphere. Miss Marple, her white hair neatly pinned and her cardigan buttoned, poured tea with a steady hand, her voice warm but firm. "Dear friends," she began, her blue eyes sweeping the room, "thank you for coming. The tragic death of Elias Humphrey has troubled us all, and I believe it's time we understood what truly happened in the bell tower. It was no accident, but a carefully staged murder." Gasps rippled through the parlor. Inspector Slack leaned forward, his pen poised. "Go on, Miss Marple," he said gruffly. "You've got my attention." She smiled faintly, setting her teacup down. Elias Humphrey was strangled with a bell rope. the scene arranged to suggest he'd slipped and tangled himself during maintenance, but the rope was deliberately frayed, not worn, and a tiny screw from the pulley system was found out of place, indicating sabotage. Elias was lured to the tower early Sunday morning, likely under false pretenses, as his pipe, usually lit during his work, was clean. Reverend Clement's hands trembled, and Griselda clutched his arm. "But who would do such a thing?" she whispered. Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Let us consider the clues." A faint scent of lavender lingered in the tower, unusual for such a place. Small footprints, those of a woman's shoe, were found near the steps. A twisted pipe cleaner, bent like a lockpick, suggested tampering, and a grease smudge, matching the bell tower's oil, was seen on a sleeve. Her eyes rested briefly on Mrs. Hargraves, who stiffened. Mr. Hargraves cleared his chest. "This is preposterous. Are you accusing someone here?" "Not yet," Miss Marple said calmly. "But let us examine motives. Elias Humphrey had discovered irregularities in the church funds, managed by Mr. Hargraves. You confronted him, didn't you, Reginald?" Hargraves' face reddened. "A misunderstanding. I explained it was an error, and I made a donation to settle it." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "But Elias found something more damning. Parish records hidden in the tower, detailing small, consistent withdrawals labeled miscellaneous. His note read, 'Amelia's doing confronted her. Not you, Mr. Hargraves, but your wife.'"
Mrs. Hargreaves' teacup clattered in its saucer, her face paling. "That's absurd," she snapped. "I barely went near the tower." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle but unyielding. "Yet you were seen there, arguing with Elias about upkeep costs. Tom Wilkins witnessed it, and the lavender scent in the tower matches your perfume. The grease smudge on your sleeve, seen the day of the murder, was bell tower oil, not easily explained by a bicycle you don't ride. And the frayed rope were cuts from shears, much like those in your sewing kit." Tom's jaw dropped, and Lydia gasped. Inspector Slack scribbled furiously, his eyes narrowing. "Go on," he urged. "The pipe cleaner," Miss Marple continued, producing it from her bag, "was twisted to pick the tower door's lock or adjust a pulley, loosening the screw I found. You visited the tower Saturday evening, Mrs. Hargreaves, to tamper with the mechanism, ensuring Elias's next task would seem fatal. When he confronted you about the embezzlement, you lured him there Sunday morning, strangled him with the rope, and staged the scene." Mrs. Hargreaves stood, her face ashen. "This is slander. I'd never—" "Why, then, the oil purchase?" Miss Marple interjected softly. "Dolly Bantry heard you bought it, claiming it was for a bicycle, and the parish records, which I found behind a beam, confirm Elias's suspicions. You'd been siphoning funds to cover personal debts, and he threatened to expose you." The room was silent, all eyes on Mrs. Hargreaves, her husband staring at her, his mouth agape. "Amelia, is this true?" he whispered. Her composure cracked, her hands trembling. "He wouldn't listen. Elias was going to ruin us. Those debts, Reginald's investments failed, and I took a little from the church just to tide us over. Elias found the records and said he'd tell the parish. I begged him, but he was stubborn. I went to the tower to reason with him, but he shouted, and I grabbed the rope in a panic. It was over so quickly." Inspector Slack stood, his voice stern. "Mrs. Hargreaves, you're under arrest for the murder of Elias Humphrey." He signaled to a constable who had been waiting outside and gently escorted her from the parlor, her sobs echoing as she left. The room exhaled collectively. Griselda clutched the vicar's hand, and Tom looked stunned. Lydia's eyes filled with tears, not for guilt, but relief. Dolly Bantry leaned towards Miss Marple, whispering, "Jane, you're a marvel." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene. "It was the small things, my dear. The grease, the scent, the shears. People cannot hide their habits." As the guests dispersed, the village's warmth seemed to return, the tension lifting like mist. The confrontation had been quiet, fitting St. Mary Mead's gentle rhythm, but the truth had been laid bare. Mrs. Hargreaves' desperation, born of financial ruin, had driven her to murder, her careful staging undone by Miss Marple's keen eye. The parlor grew quiet, save for the tick of the clock and the faint rustle of Miss Marple's knitting, resumed at last. The mystery was solved, but one task remained, to explain it fully over morning tea and restore the village's peace.
Chapter 10. Tea and Reflections. The morning sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in soft hues of gold and pink. The cottages along the high street glowed with quiet warmth, their thatched roofs glistening with dew, while the scent of freshly baked scones wafted from the bakery. The green buzzed with early activity. Children scampered toward the schoolhouse, and the Women's Institute ladies already whispered plans for the upcoming fete. The bell tower of St. Mary's Church, silent for days, rang out once more, its peals clear and steady under the careful hands of young Tom Wilkins, who had taken up Elias Humphrey's mantle. The village's cozy rhythm had returned, yet the shadow of the recent murder lingered, its resolution fresh in the minds of those who gathered in Miss Jane Marple's garden for a final reckoning over morning tea. Miss Marple's cottage, with its climbing clematis and neatly trimmed rose bushes, was a haven of tranquility. The garden table was set with her best china, a pot of steaming Earl Grey, and a platter of buttery scones, their golden tops glistening beside a dish of clotted cream and strawberry jam. The guests arrived promptly at 10, their faces a mix of relief and curiosity. Dolly Bantry swept in first, her floral hat bobbing as she embraced Miss Marple. "Jane, you've done it again," she exclaimed, settling into a wicker chair. Reverend Leonard Clement and Griselda followed, the vicar's expression lighter than it had been in days, though his hands still fidgeted slightly. Tom Wilkins arrived, his cap in hand, looking both proud and solemn in his new role as bell ringer. Mrs. Lydia Finch, her sewing basket absent for once, offered a shy smile, her eyes clear of tears. Inspector Slack, his uniform slightly less crisp after a sleepless night, brought up the rear, his notebook tucked away, but his gaze sharp. Miss Marple poured tea with her usual grace, her white hair catching the sunlight as she smiled at her guests. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice soft but clear. "The tragic events in the bell tower have been resolved, but I thought it fitting to gather and reflect, as we so often do in St. Mary Mead, over a cup of tea." Griselda leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Jane, I'm still reeling. Mrs. Hargreaves, of all people, how did you know?" Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "It was the small things, my dear. In a village, life is made of patterns, and when those patterns are disrupted, the truth often lies in the details we overlook. Shall I explain?" "Please do," Dolly urged, spreading jam on a scone. "I want every bit of it." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her knitting needles idle for now. Elias Humphrey's death was no accident. The bell rope around his neck, staged to suggest a fall, was deliberately frayed, not worn, but cut with shears. A tiny screw from the pulley system, found loose, and a twisted pipe cleaner, shaped like a lockpick, pointed to sabotage. Elias was lured to the tower early Sunday morning, as his clean pipe, usually lit during his work, suggested he hadn't settled into his routine. Inspector Slack nodded grudgingly. "I missed that pipe business. But go on, what led you to Mrs. Hargreaves?" "The clues converged on her," Miss Marple said. "A faint scent of lavender lingered in the tower, matching her perfume. Small footprints, those of a woman's shoe, were found near the steps. Most telling was the grease smudge on her sleeve, seeing the day of the murder, which matched the bell tower's oil. She claimed it was from a bicycle, but Dolly's gossip confirmed she doesn't ride. Then there was the oil she bought,
supposedly for that same bicycle, a purchase Clara at the shop overheard. Dolly clapped her hands. I knew that tidbit would help, but what about the motive? Miss Marple's expression grew somber. Elias discovered old parish records hidden behind a beam in the tower, detailing small withdrawals labeled miscellaneous. His note read, Amelia's doing, confronted her. Mrs. Hargreaves had been siphoning church funds to cover personal debts from her husband's failed investments. Elias threatened to expose her, and she couldn't bear the shame or ruin. Reverend Clement shook his head. I knew Elias found those papers, but I thought they were just old debts. I never imagined. You weren't to blame, Leonard, Miss Marple said gently. Elias was stubborn, as you said, and confronted her alone. Mrs. Hargreaves visited the tower Saturday evening, tampering with the pulley and fraying the rope with her sewing shears to ensure a plausible accident. On Sunday, she lured Elias there, perhaps claiming an urgent issue with the bells. In a moment of panic, when he refused to stay silent, she strangled him with the rope and staged the scene. Tom Wilkins, his face pale, spoke up. I saw her arguing with him Thursday, miss. She was furious about the funds. I should have said more. You helped greatly, Tom, Miss Marple reassured him. Your mention of the loose pulley and the odd tangling of the ropes confirmed the sabotage. The pipe cleaner, likely used to adjust the pulley or pick the tower's door lock, was another piece of the puzzle. Lydia Finch dabbed her eyes. I feel awful suspecting Elias for spite over the silver bell. He didn't deserve this. Miss Marple patted her hand. Your grief was natural, Lydia. But your motive was weak, and your glove in the tower was a red herring, likely left by Mrs. Hargreaves to divert suspicion. As for Colonel Bantry's hat and Mrs. Price Ridley's shadowy figure, those were distractions, easily explained by a muddy fox hunt and an overactive imagination. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. I'll admit, Miss Marple, I was focused on Tom and Lydia. That glove seemed damning. How do you see past it? By watching people, she replied. Mrs. Hargreaves' fastidious nature made the grease smudge stand out. Her defensive manner when I mentioned the tower and her purchase of oil sealed it. People are like village life, full of habits, and when those habits break, the truth slips through. Griselda sighed. It's so sad. Amelia always seemed so proper. What happens now? She's confessed, Slack said. She'll face trial, but her remorse may lighten her sentence. Mr. Hargreaves is cooperating, claiming he knew nothing of her actions. Miss Marple nodded. Reginald's hands were too soft for the ropes, and his motive was weaker. He made amends for his own errors, but Amelia acted alone, driven by desperation. The tea party continued, the mood lightening as the village's warmth reasserted itself. Tom spoke of his plans to honor Humphrey with a special peal at the fete, and Reverend Clement shared ideas for a bell restoration fund, easing his lingering guilt. Lydia, relieved, promised to donate her inherited savings to the church, and Dolly regaled them with plans for a grand fete stall. As the guests departed, Miss Marple stood at her garden gate, watching the village come alive. The bells rang out, their clear notes echoing across the green, a symbol of restored order. Children laughed, the baker's boy cycled past, and the Women's Institute ladies waved from their stall. St. Mary Mead was itself again, its secrets laid bare, and its harmony intact. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the pale blue shawl nearly complete. It's like life, she mused, her needles clicking softly. A few tangled threads, but with care, the pattern emerges clear and true.
Thank you, dear listener, for joining this gentle journey tonight. May the story's quiet mystery and comforting atmosphere stay with you as you drift deeper into peaceful rest.
Remember, there will always be another tale waiting for you here, ready to soothe, to comfort, and to carry you into sweet dreams. Until next time, sleep well, rest deeply, and good night.